ever feel like, when you're trying to set boundaries, it's almost like this impossible game?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, like you're always kind of second guessing yourself,
Mhm.
especially when you consider like how our families, especially those early experiences, kind of shaped how we view those boundaries in the first place?
Yeah, it's fascinating how much those early dynamics carry over. It's like
Right.
you're handed this invisible rule book and you don't even
And
realize
thought
it's
would chase.
shaping your relationships.
Okay, so speaking of those hidden rule books, we're diving into all things boundaries today, especially within the context of complex trauma. And to help us navigate this, we're turning to Tim Fletcher's insights from his video on boundaries and, what was it, people pleasing.
Yeah, that's the one.
So before we unpack all those unhealthy patterns and how to break free,
Yeah.
let's define complex trauma. What are we really talking about here?
So, complex trauma, it's not just a one-time event. Think of it as this kind of like pervasive impact of experiencing or maybe even just witnessing
Hmm.
adversity or neglect within a family system.
Okay, so it's like the
Yeah.
long-term
That's
effect
the long term, yeah.
of that dysfunction.
Exactly. Like chronic emotional manipulation, those unpredictable outbursts, or maybe even just this constant feeling of never quite feeling safe. Those experiences often lead to some, well, let's just say interesting coping mechanisms, many of which show up as distorted or even completely absent boundaries.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? So instead of learning how to like voice their needs and set those healthy boundaries, a child in this type of environment, they almost adapt in ways that are, well, detrimental in the long run.
It's true.
It's like their internal alarm system gets totally rewired.
Such a good analogy. And it's not always a conscious choice either, right? You've got these families often struggling with their own unresolved pain, so they create these rules and boundaries that are less about genuine well-being and more about just controlling behavior to minimize any immediate discomfort.
Okay, so paint a picture for us. What does that actually look like in a family setting?
Imagine a home where the rule is silence at dinner, not because it fosters connection, but just because it lets someone disappear behind a newspaper.
See, that image just like sends chills down my spine. And it's not because it's uncommon, but because it highlights how easy it is to mistake control for connection, especially in families where, actually expressing your needs openly is just not the norm. It's like silence equals peace, but at what cost?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the thing is, those rigid, wildly inconsistent rules, they might create this temporary facade of, like, safety or control, but they're sending a very loud message to a child. It's like saying your needs come second, rules are inherently restrictive, and true happiness, well, that's found in bunking them.
It's almost like that universal urge to touch wet cement when there's a sign, right? You know you shouldn't, but there's something about that rule that makes you want to rebel. It's
Yeah.
like the rule itself becomes more about suppressing joy than actually like guiding healthy behavior.
Exactly. And sadly, these deeply ingrained patterns don't just vanish when we become adults. They follow us into our relationships, our jobs, and they often play out in ways we don't even realize.
Especially for those of us on a healing journey, right? Trying to break free from those old patterns.
Oh, 100%.
So how do those early experiences actually show up in our adult relationships, particularly in recovery?
Well, it often looks like this intense fear of rejection that dictates everything. Like you feel responsible for a partner's happiness, and the only way to, keep them close is to anticipate their every need.
Mhm.
It's that belief that setting boundaries equals pushing people away, that intimacy can only exist when lives are totally enmeshed.
Wow, I think a lot of us are nodding our heads right now like, oh, that's me.
Right.
It's amazing how those early experiences are such powerful influencers even years later.
They really are, and they often operate just below the surface, which makes them even more difficult to address.
Okay, so then how do we untangle those patterns, especially when our default is either to people pleasers or just completely shut down? Like, how do we learn to set boundaries from a place of self-respect and love, not fear?
Well, it's interesting you say that. There's actually a framework in the Bible, Matthew 18, that offers some surprisingly relevant advice.
Ooh, I love when we can bring in ancient wisdom like that. For those who might not be familiar, what does Matthew 18 say about setting boundaries?
So it basically lays out this like three-step process for addressing unhealthy behaviors in those close relationships. And it's amazing how it emphasizes both like love and accountability, which
Okay, because we don't want to just go around like throwing down the law.
exactly, it's not about punishment, it's
Yeah.
about growth.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell us more about these steps.
So it starts with that direct one-on-one conversation, just you and the other person, no drama, no audience, just clear communication.
Okay, keeping it real.
Exactly. Now, if the issue keeps coming up, it's not a one and done kind of thing. It suggests bringing in one or two other people, not as like an intervention squad.
Right, not an ambush.
Exactly, but as like a support system, people who can offer some outside perspective.
Okay, so almost like accountability partners,
Hmm.
but in like a healthy, supportive way.
That's a great way to put it. And then lastly, if things still aren't changing, if the person is still, not respecting those boundaries, it suggests taking it to the wider community.
Okay, so that feels kind of intense, really. Like, when do we actually need to take it to that level?
Yeah, that's definitely the proceed with caution step. But it's important to remember this isn't about bad-mouthing the person or gossiping.
Right, we're not trying to, like, publicly shame anyone.
Exactly. It's more about like seeking support and accountability from a wider circle of people who can offer guidance, maybe even some tough love when needed.
So it's like surrounding yourself with wisdom as you navigate those choppy waters. I like that.
Right. And remember, the goal is still restoration and healing, but it also recognizes that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is, create some healthy distance.
It's that whole, like, I love you, but I don't like you right now kind of thing.
Ray, it's a tough kind of love, for sure. But sometimes, when someone's not respecting those boundaries, creating that distance can be a wake-up call. Like those natural consequences, sometimes those are the things that spark real change.
It's like that saying, sometimes you have to love people from afar.
Yeah. It's about recognizing that you can't force someone else's growth. You can only control how you choose to engage.
It's about surrendering that need to control the situation and trusting that whatever happens, you'll navigate it with grace.
Beautifully said. And this whole conversation, it applies to family dynamics as well, which can be a whole other...
Oh, don't even get me started on family. That's where it gets really tricky.
Right, because there's this added layer of like unconditional love and acceptance that can make setting those boundaries feel almost impossible.
It's like, if they're family.
Yes.
Right. Like, that should trump everything else.
Exactly. And the thing is, you can't choose your family, but you can choose how you let those relationships impact you, even when those choices are, difficult or challenge those long-held expectations.
It's almost like we inherit those family patterns, those
Yeah.
unspoken rules, and
Yeah.
breaking free is like rewriting the entire script.
Exactly. And just to be clear, setting boundaries, it's not about like judging others or placing blame.
It's not about keeping score.
Right. It's about taking responsibility for your own well-being and creating the space for those healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
And isn't that what we all want?
Absolutely. And it's also about recognizing your own worthiness, which can be a big mindset shift for people
Yeah.
who are used to always putting others first.
It's like we forget that saying no sometimes, it's not a rejection of the relationship, but a way to actually protect it.
Yes. And create that healthy space where both people can actually show up authentically.
Because that's where the real magic happens, right?
100%.
When we can be ourselves, fully and freely, in those safe and supportive relationships.
That's what it's all about. And something Tim Fletcher talks about that really resonated with me is this connection between humility and boundaries.
Oh, tell me more.
So he says that real humility, it's not about being a pushover or shrinking yourself so others can feel bigger. True humility, it's actually about recognizing that we're all equally deserving of respect and consideration, and honoring our own needs is just as important as honoring those of others.
Okay, now, that is a game changer, especially for those of us who, were raised to believe that putting ourselves first is somehow selfish or wrong.
Exactly. It's a total paradigm shift, and it takes a lot of awareness and honestly courage to start living from that place.
Because it's almost like we have to reprogram those old tapes in our minds, right?
Right.
Those tapes that say, don't rock the boat, or it's not okay to prioritize your needs.
It's a process for sure. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. Reach out, connect, find those supportive people who get it, whether it's friends, a therapist, a support group, whoever can offer that listening ear and encouragement, because it makes a world of difference.
It really does. So as we wrap up part 2 of this deep dive, I'm curious, what's resonating with you most right now? What's that one new insight that's really sticking with you? It's like we're learning this whole new way of communicating, right?
Yeah, like a crash course in
Yeah, exactly.
Boundaries
Yeah.
101, which can feel honestly kind of awkward at first,
Right.
especially
Tell me about it.
if you're used to like defaulting to people pleasing or just avoiding conflict at all costs.
Right. Like, oh, this is how you actually have a healthy disagreement? Who knew?
Seriously.
Yeah.
And it really makes me think about how, for those of us who grew up with those blurry boundaries in our families, setting boundaries as adults, especially with family, can feel like, I don't know, almost impossible at times.
Oh, 100%.
You know.
Because then you have that layer of, like, but family
Exactly.
and all those expectations and guilt trips that come with that. It's like, well, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. But what you can choose is how you let those relationships,
Impact you.
yes, impact you, how you engage, even when it means, ruffling some feathers or having those tough conversations.
Yeah, because let's be honest, that can bring up a ton of guilt and fear, right? Because when you start setting boundaries, you're basically like disrupting the whole family system.
Yeah.
And systems, even if they're messy and dysfunctional, they like to maintain that equilibrium.
It's like the minute you start prioritizing your own well-being, suddenly you're the black sheep,
Exactly.
the troublemaker.
Suddenly, everyone's got an opinion about your choices.
Right. And it's no wonder so many people just avoid those conversations altogether. It's like, it's just easier to keep the peace.
It's definitely the path of least resistance, right?
Right.
But the problem is avoiding those conversations, shrinking yourself to make everyone else comfortable, it just keeps those unhealthy patterns stuck in place.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It might look okay on the surface, but underneath, it's a hot mess.
Such a good analogy. And in the long run, it just leads to like resentment, burnout, and this feeling of like, who am I?
Yes. It's
Yeah.
like you lose yourself in the process of trying to keep everyone else happy.
And we forget that true peace. It can't exist without authenticity and respect, too.
So powerful. Because sometimes those difficult conversations, those moments where we finally speak our truth, they might be uncomfortable in the moment, but they can actually be the catalyst for a deeper, more authentic connection.
100%. Because when you can show up as your true self, communicate your needs respectfully, and set those boundaries without fear, that's when true intimacy becomes possible.
Because it's not about building walls or cutting people off. It's about creating that safe and strong foundation for a genuine connection.
And sometimes, that journey of setting boundaries, of healing those old wounds, it might mean taking a step back from certain relationships, even if it's with family. And as difficult as that is,
Oh, it can be heartbreaking.
it can be so incredibly liberating, too.
Because it's in those moments when you finally choose yourself that you open up the possibility of creating a new, healthier dynamic
Oh, there
with your biological family or with the people you choose to call family.
I love that. Because ultimately, it's not about being right or wrong. It's not about keeping score.
It's about honoring your own truth,
Yes.
creating a life that reflects who you truly are and what you value.
And recognizing that you deserve relationships that are life-giving, not draining. Relationships where your boundaries are respected, where you feel safe to just be yourself, imperfections and all.
Yes. And on that note, as we wrap up this deep dive into all things boundaries, what is one thing, one takeaway that you'll leave with today? What will you choose to apply in your own life? And remember, you don't have to do this alone. Reach out, connect, and keep believing in the transformative power of healthy boundaries. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.